Recently, we experienced one of the greatest victories for the pro-life movement, the overturn of Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade, as you all know, was the 1973 Supreme Court case that legalized abortion federally. Yet Roe v. Wade was overturned in another Supreme Court case titled Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization. The roots of this case go back to 2018. In March of 2018, the state of Mississippi passed a law titled the Gestational Age Act, which outlawed abortion for any reason after 15 weeks. The only exceptions being to protect the health of the mother or if the child suffers from a major health issue that would prevent them from surviving outside of the womb. Eventually, a local abortion clinic called the Jackson Women's Health Organization sued the state of Mississippi, and in particular Thomas E. Dobbs, a health official within the Mississippi State Department of Health, and Kenneth Cleveland, the director of the State Board of Medical Licensure. The Jackson Women's Health Organization claims that this bill was unconstitutional. The case was brought before Judge Carlton W. Reeves, a judge for the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Mississippi, who in November of 2018 declared that since there is no evidence for the viability of fetuses prior to between 23 and 24 weeks, the state had no vested interest in outlawing abortion prior to that point. He also put an injunction against the state of Mississippi asking to reverse or amend the law, but the state of Mississippi refused, and in fact they appealed the case. The Fifth Circuit Court, which heard the case, came to the same conclusion as Judge Reeves in December of 2019. In the meantime, the state of Mississippi passed another law outlawing all abortions after the detection of the first heartbeat. This would have outlawed all abortions as early as between 6 and 12 weeks. The District Court for the Southern District of Mississippi put forward an injunction against this law in May of 2019. Yet in June of 2020, the state of Mississippi chose to challenge both of these injunctions, and it was brought before the Supreme Court. Arguments didn't officially begin until December of 2021, and the Supreme Court came to an official decision on June 24, 2022. The official position of the Supreme Court was, in a word, that the, quote, Constitution does not confer a right to abortion, unquote, and that, quote, Roe v. Wade and Casey v. Planned Parenthood are overruled, unquote. The basis on which the court stated this was that both Roe v. Wade and Casey v. Planned Parenthood, the former of which established a quote-unquote right to an abortion on a federal level, the latter of which affirmed and expanded such quote-unquote rights, states that the right to an abortion is affirmed on the basis of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which says in Section 1, quote, all persons born or naturalized in the United States are subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws, unquote. Basically, what is said here is that the government cannot make any laws that violate the rights or privileges of its citizens, and that at least some of these rights could be taken away as a punishment for crimes, but punishments for crimes can only take place as a result of due process. Pro-choice advocates say that abortion is one of the rights classified under the rights to, quote, life, liberty, and property, which the state cannot deprive anyone of. The Supreme Court went on to say, quote, the Constitution makes no express reference to a right to obtain abortion, unquote. So basically what it's saying is that there is no explicit reference to abortion in any part of the Constitution, let alone the 14th Amendment. Some have argued that the right to an abortion is implicit in the 14th Amendment, particularly when you look at the 14th Amendment in light of the First, Fourth, Fifth, and Ninth Amendments, all of which seem to imply a right to privacy, which constitutes one of our most basic freedoms. Still, none of these amendments explicitly or directly deal with abortion. The Supreme Court even called the notion that the right to abortion is justified by the Constitution in an implicit sense, but that attempts to try to find a specific or direct reference to abortion in the Constitution are of secondary importance, as an quote-unquote unfocused analysis. Some have attempted to argue that the 14th Amendment says that the government cannot, quote, deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law, unquote. This is known as the Equal Protection Clause. Since only women get abortions, some have argued that denying women abortions is a violation of the Equal Protection Clause, since it is putting women at an unfair disadvantage. Yet the Supreme Court decision went on to say, quote, the regulation of a medical procedure that only one sex can undergo does not trigger heightened constitutional scrutiny unless the regulation is a mere pretext designed to effect an individual's discrimination against members of one sex or another, unquote. Now, there is more that the Supreme Court has to say on this topic. But my purpose here is not to speak of the legal arguments for or against abortion. Rather, my goal is to speak of the moral implications of abortion. And more specifically, I want to point out the fact that abortion is never going to go away. As the Supreme Court said, quote, the authority to regulate abortion is returned to the people and their elected representatives, unquote. That is, states still have the authority to regulate the extent to which abortion is legal. So, hypothetically, one state could have a very lenient set of regulations on abortion, while the next state over could have very strict regulations on abortion. What is to stop people from going to states that have lenient abortion laws, or from getting abortions illegally? Overturning Roe v. Wade is not a final victory as much as an improbable milestone people thought it would be. Simply changing laws is not enough to actually change the minds and hearts of the people. This can be seen in the fact that in the weekend immediately following the recent Supreme Court ruling, protests were held in opposition to this ruling, some of them having attendance numbering in the thousands. For example, protests held in Chicago, New York City, and San Francisco had thousands of people attending, and protests in Washington, D.C. had over 100,000 participants. In Los Angeles, protesters gathered on the highway. So many gathered that traffic was brought almost to a complete standstill. Other places also witnessed protests, though to a much lesser degree. Several dozen people gathered outside of Fresno City Hall to protest the recent Supreme Court decision. And in Charleston, West Virginia, there were over 200 people gathered in protest. Protests in Arizona turned violent and ended with police officers having to use tear gas against protesters. The Department of Public Safety stated that the between 7,000 and 8,000 person large crowd of protesters attempted to break into the Arizona State House, whereas protesters denied this, stating that the protests were for the most part peaceful and that the violent overreactions on the part of the police are what caused it to become violent. Protests held in the state of Rhode Island quickly turned violent as well, as fistfights broke out between pro-life and pro-choice activists. Certain high-profile figures spoke out against the recent decision. President Joe Biden called it a, quote, sad day, unquote, for the U.S. The pop singer Billie Eilish said during a concert that, quote, "Today is a really dark day for women in the United States," unquote. People still believe that abortion is a right. That isn't going to go away just because the Supreme Court made a decision that pro-lifers like. Not only that, but powerful and influential people will continue to support the pro-choice cause and use their influence to spread their ideology. And finally, there are both pro-life and pro-choice activists who feel so strongly about their opinions that they will feel justified in taking part in actions that make worse the already tense political situation in this country. That is why the most important thing to do is attempt to change the minds and hearts of the people directly, not just to change laws. And I hope to contribute to this, even if only in a small way, in this video. Now, on the side, I also work as a journalist for my diocese's official newspaper. Back about a month ago, my local state legislature was debating a bill that would expand upon Medicaid to include abortion. I was asked to cover the debate. As usual, there were protesters there, and I interviewed some of them to get their opinions. In this video, I will play some of the recordings that I made of interviews with people that I took part in while waiting for the actual debating of this bill to begin, and I'll analyze some of the opinions that I found.
So I just think that what a woman chooses to do with her body is absolutely no one's business. It should not be something that the state even has an opinion on, and I think that we just need to drop it. We've been fighting for this since the 60s, and it just needs to be over.
So obviously, there are a lot of presuppositions built into her statements about what the purview of the state's authority is. Obviously, the government does not have the right or the authority to enforce every single virtue or outlaw every single vice. This is something I would agree with as a Catholic. For example, does the government have the right to tell you what sort of toothpaste to use? Does the government tell you that you can't or shouldn't brush your teeth with gravel or with highly corrosive substances? Does the government have the right to force you to brush your teeth at all? Obviously, you should brush your teeth on a regular basis. Obviously, there are some things that serve as good forms of toothpaste and others that don't. Obviously, some types of toothpaste are better than others. Nonetheless, the government can't regulate that. On the other hand, is abortion simply on the same level as brushing your teeth? She says, quote, "What a woman chooses to do with her body is absolutely no one's business, and should not be something that the state even has an opinion on," unquote. Now, I know this was a brief, few-minute-long interview, not an in-depth debate or discussion, but she seems to be presupposing what she needs to prove. You see, if the fetus is just an extension of the mother's body, then having an abortion is no different than getting your tonsils removed or brushing your teeth. Whether or not you do it, or whether or not you should do it, is not something the government has the right to regulate. On the other hand, if the fetus can be considered a person, then it is an entity distinct from the mother. Therefore, getting an abortion is a medical procedure that affects other people, in a manner upwards of and including death. So from a pro-life perspective, abortion is something that the government should get involved in, that the government should either regulate or even outright outlaw, because it's something that results in the death of another person. Now, of course, we can have a little bit more general of a debate on whether or not the government is a morally or socially licit concept to begin with, or how wide or how narrow the government's authority should be. This would be the debates between anarchists and libertarians on the one hand, and non-anarchists or non-libertarians on the other. You can believe that abortion is wrong while still believing that making laws against abortion is also wrong, mostly because you don't believe that there should be a government. or because you believe that the authority of the government should be extremely narrow. But for those who do not accept the premises of anarchist or libertarian thought, then the debate is about whether or not the fetus is a person. And if it is a person, then yes, abortion should be outlawed or at the very least extremely regulated.
It's a personal decision, and people's religious views should not affect their views on public policy.
This actually gets into an interesting topic. Is it possible to fully separate your religious views, your moral views, and your political views? I would say no. Religions make moral claims, and make claims that have moral implications to them. Different religions have different ethical stances on various issues, or have different ways of justifying common ethical conclusions. So people's ethical views are, in many ways, influenced by their religion. People with different religious views will thus very often have different ethical views, or will have the same ethical views but have different ways of justifying or explaining them. And ethics, or morality, on the other hand, also highly influences your views on politics. For example, why do you support a particular law? Because you think it is just. Yet justice is a virtue. So by saying that something is just, you are making a moral claim. There's thus no such thing as a political claim that is 100% free of moral implications. There's also no such thing as a moral claim that is 100% free of some sort of religious influence. If religion can influence morality and morality can influence politics, then you cannot fully 100% separate your religious views from your political views, even if you don't always use explicitly religious arguments for your political positions. And it works both ways. Can you be consistently Catholic and pro-choice? No, not really. Most Catholics who identify as pro-choice usually say, either explicitly or implicitly, I accept Catholic teaching on everything else, but not on this. So what you see is one's views on politics influencing how they interpret their religion. But it can also work the other way. If a person wants to be an ideologically consistent Catholic, then they will accept the Catholic views on abortion. So that's an example of religion influencing politics. In the end of the day, I would respond by essentially saying, what is the starting point of your larger worldview? Is it more general political considerations, or is it your religious views? Which actually leads to another point of what she said.
I belong to the ACLU since 1974, in part so that Catholics can be opposed to choice. But that's a personal decision.
Yeah, it's not just a personal decision. The problem, overall, doesn't seem to be the fact that they don't want to hear from religious people, but the fact that they don't want to hear from certain types of religious people. For example, at the event, a group of more religious pro-life activists started praying during the protests, and someone yelled out, "When the churches start paying taxes, then they can have an opinion on abortion." The thing is, there wasn't a single clergyman on the entire pro-life side, whereas there were two clergymen, white, male, Christian clergymen, I may add, who put forward testimonials in favor of the pro-choice decision. So I guess secularism, feminism, and critical race theory don't really matter if the quote-unquote religious fanatics and quote-unquote oppressors happen to have the same opinions as you. And this showcases what really angers me about the debates surrounding abortion. At some point, it becomes more about politics in the crudest possible sense than about making just decisions. It's about developing the best technique to get votes, and it affects both sides. I was interviewing a priest for an article I wrote for my diocesan newspaper on assisted suicide, and the priest didn't want the interview recorded or excerpts from it included in the newspaper because he thought it was politically imprudent. He thought that it would lead to the false perception that the pro-life stance is primarily a sectarian or religious stance. There are some people who are anti-Catholic or anti-religious and thus would automatically reject his opinion simply because he was a Catholic priest. The pro-life movement is thus intent on showing, hey, we're not just a bunch of Catholic or conservative religious people, anyone can be pro-life. The same sentiments, in the opposite direction, is also found among pro-choicers. Why do you think they had not one, but two clergymen giving testimonials? To win over the religious crowd. Again, it is as if they were trying to say, hey, the pro-choice movement isn't just a bunch of angry feminists or beta male soy boys. Both sides are attempting to create a coalition of political allies from diverse demographics in order to create a very specific image of themselves that they think will convince those on the fence. I get why they are doing it, but too much emphasis on that misses the core moral and political reasons for the debate. Another person I interviewed said the following.
And I've seen plenty of suffering from unwanted babies and women who have to have babies that they don't want, and I don't want to see the suffering continue.
I mean, couldn't there be other ways to prevent unwanted pregnancies outside of abortion? For example, a change in our sexual ethics. For example, saving ourselves until marriage. Not having sex if you don't think you can deal with the potential long-term consequences of sex. You know, the whole philosophy of foregoing immediate gratification for the sake of a greater long-term good. That probably could eliminate a lot of the reasons for abortion. And if a person does have a pregnancy that's unwanted, maybe they're poor, maybe they don't see themselves as psychologically or physically fit to care for a child, maybe they just don't want children, there are things such as adoption or various charitable organizations that could help out the mother. But even then, the other person is presupposing that abortion, while extreme, is still a valid response to unwanted pregnancies. And this, in turn, presupposes a whole series of views on the nature of the unborn child. Is it a person? Does it have the same rights as the mother? And hopefully I can make a video about that individual topic in another video. Now, there is a specific situation in which things become more complex, namely when the health of the mother is at stake. I would also like to make another video on that at some point in the future, but the overall logic remains. In the vast majority of cases, there are ways of dealing with or avoiding unwanted pregnancies, or dealing with the potential adverse effects of pregnancy without resorting to abortion, especially in today's world when medicine and charitable organizations help us to deal with the medical issues surrounding pregnancy or the negative after effects of pregnancy. All of this reminds me of a quote from the journalist and social critic Peter Hitchens, who said, and I quote, "Abortion is the only event that modern liberals think too violent and too obscene to portray on TV. This is not because they are squeamish or prudish. It is because if people knew what abortion really looked like, it would destroy the pretense that abortion is a civilized answer to the problem of what to do with unwanted pregnancies." Unquote. Overall, I would like to conclude by saying that the debate is far from over. People will still support abortions, and people will still try to find ways to get abortion. Some parts of the country will still even allow abortion, even now that Roe v. Wade is completely overturned. The only way to fight this grave moral evil is by directly addressing the arguments for or against it, by helping poor families and mothers with unwanted pregnancies, and by fighting pro-choice policies on the local level. With this in mind, I would like to thank you for joining me, and God bless.